The end of a journey is, in many ways, determined by the beginning. Some journeys are longer, more treacherous, even more meaningful than others. But we're all going somewhere. In the beginning, in the end, well, they will be forever connected, no matter how far you go.
People smile and tell me I'm the lucky one, and we've just begun. I think I'm gonna have a son. He will be like you and me, as free as a dove. Oh, conceived in love, the sun is gonna shine above. And even though we ain't got money, I'm so in love with you, honey, and everything will bring a chain of love. And in the morning when I rise, you bring a tear of joy to my eyes and tell me everything is gonna be alright.
In life itself, which is by far the biggest journey we will ever take, we aren't really part of the beginning. We sort of are the beginning. We don't pick our parents, and they don't pick theirs either. A person is just not there to vote on things until conception has already happened. And then we are on our way, and we have to make the most of it.
And even though we ain't got money, I'm so in love with you, honey, and everything will bring a chain of love. And in the morning when I rise, you bring a tear of joy to my eyes and tell me everything is gonna be alright.
I've never met my biological father, and neither has my mother. Fertility issues led my mother into a clinic specializing in donor conception. Being donor conceived means that my father promised to have nothing to do with me. It means that I know next to nothing about him, not even his name. All I do know about him was that he was donor number 81. I wondered, am I strange or bad for wanting to know who my father is? I started looking for him in my teens, but there were no DNA tests back then. And the fertility clinic that my mother used had shut down and they went out of business, so it was completely impossible for me to find him.
Zygen Laboratory has ceased operations. Please do not leave a message on this line. It will not be returned.
I think the average child, wants to know their father, be known by their father, love their father, and be loved by their father. I think this kind of there's a sort of a primal, and even kind of to know where your father comes from in terms of his people, his parents, his kin, his heritage, and so that's there's a kind of desire that many kids have for that kind of connection with their father that extends beyond just getting his DNA.
So I was working at this restaurant in San Francisco, and my mom called me and she let me know that there was this piece of paper that she had come across that said that he was Polish. This is the first time I knew this. He was Polish and he was raised Catholic. And suddenly, I had this part of my identity. I knew what country I was from overnight. And once I had that information, I became so sensitive to this identity of being Polish. I knew nothing about Poland, and I knew nothing about Catholicism, but there was this very famous Polish man who happened to be Catholic, and his name was John Paul II. And I glommed on to John Paul II because I wanted to find out more about my identity. I wanted to find out what it meant to be Polish, what it meant to be Catholic. And I started to read Theology of the Body. I started to read Love and Responsibility. And I fell in love with his works. I fell in love with his teachings. And I really started to think of him as my father.
Another important thing that happened in the 60s and 70s was the sexual revolution. So we see in the 60s with the rise of the pill, with dramatic changes in the popular culture, Woodstock, etc., that people became much more open to what was then called free love.
When people think of the sexual revolution, they immediately think of 1969, hippies, Woodstock, and it was the free love movement that has led to generations of people looking for real love.
But at the time, free love was a term that meant sex without consequences, sex without babies. And that idea led to other ideas. And eventually we got to where we are today on this journey.
The sexual revolution really, detached sex from, first from marriage, and then detached, parenthood from marriage.
The fundamental error, myth, lie at the heart of the sexual revolution is that the point of sex is to produce good experiences in the psyche.
It used to be impolite to talk about sex.
Of course you can reach people by talking about sexuality. Sex is terribly interesting. Sex and religion, the two funniest and most wonderful things in the world.
On the one hand, the sexual revolution idolized the body, right? Held the body up as the be-all and end-all, and we came to worship the body. But if you look at the arc of the sexual revolution, it's now ending. We might say we're on in the last lap of the sexual revolution, and that idolatry of the body is now ending in a kind of body hatred, a violent rejection of our bodies. And this is predictable, because whenever we raise up an idol, we're expecting something in this world to do something it can't possibly do. We wanted the body to be our ultimate fulfillment. We wanted sex to be ultimate pleasure and ultimate happiness. That's what the sexual revolution held out to us. But of course, it couldn't deliver that.
Sex is sacred because it creates new people. And the sexual revolution, however, it truly stymied our intellectual connection between sex and babies.
At all moments, procreative or non-procreative sexual moments, that sex is a big deal because it joins you in a very profound way. It's linked with future, family, generation, interconnectedness of this most profound order. And so when you take that away and it becomes a physical transaction with no relationship to the future at all, then it's much more likely to result in hurt feelings, obviously sexually transmitted infections, unintended pregnancies, but the, not to diminish those at all, but you lose the understanding of the meaning of this profound connection between men and women, that this is the place where humanity springs up.
Not using a contraceptive is basically always saying to the other person, I'm willing to have a long-term relationship with you. I'm open to having children with you. I'm open to a complete commitment.
A technology that was designed to create more planned families, more stable families, more, in a sense, two-parent families, ended up helping to create a world where there were many more single-parent families, where there was more family instability.
So one of the great ironies in the study of sexual relationship behavior is how Paul VI was right back when he wrote Humane Vitae about, at least from my angle, especially about the sort of the respect that is due to women, and how the pill would virtually guarantee a scenario or a social situation where he wouldn't be doing that, right? And he wouldn't be seeking in her the sort of bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, complementary union, but rather treating her poorly for what she can give him, and she puts up with it.
50 years ago, you could make the argument that this was a benign experiment, that contraception would free humanity and especially put women on an equal footing with men. But 50 years later, there is evidence from all over that this experiment is not making people happy. There's social science evidence. For example, happiness studies themselves, showing that it appears that not only in the United States, but across the Western world, female happiness has declined in the last 50 years. Why should that be if contraception was supposed to free women from what were said to be the chains of their fertility?
The point from the beginning, as I see it, was and still is happiness. Happiness is what we want. Back then we wanted this world of sex without babies so that women could feel free. And now we'd all love to go back to a world when men did not see women as these infertile objects for pleasure.
What did we expect was going to happen? Women, for the most part, would love to be treated as fully human, naturally fertile, potential mothers, meaning the right order of things was good.
We'd have a much better chance at happiness if we just go along with gravity. Gravity meaning love leads to marriage, marriage leading to sex, sex leading to babies, and then babies leading to more love.
These errors, with their terrible social consequences, are all linked together. These are not separate. What's going on with the commodification of children and of women as surrogates, for example, in the assisted reproduction industry, is tied to the divorce culture. It's tied to the loss of a sense of sexual morality, the idea that sex belongs in marriage, that marriage is a man and a woman, that sex outside the bond of marriage is bad, not good. Sex within the bond of marriage, good. Unless we see the relationships between these things, we're going to be fiddling around with individual pieces of a jigsaw puzzle and failing to see how they fit together.
There's a passage in Scripture that says, where sin increases, grace overflows all the more. Well, this is no exception. And in this case, grace may even have had a head start. The remedy to some of the fallout from the sexual revolution was already being worked on by a young couple in Australia, Doctors John and Evelyn Billings.
In 1953, John Billings, a young neurologist, he was asked by his parish priest, Father Morris Catarinich, if he would help him to help couples who were having difficulties in their marriages because they were struggling with their fertility. John wasn't interested in natural family planning or any family planning. It was just because Father Catarinich had asked him to help people that John responded.
He said, look, I'll turn my attention to it, but I'm only going to give it 3 months. Well, then he did it for the rest of his life.
When he asked me to help him, I said, that's not for me. I don't know anything about that subject, and I'm not particularly interested. So he came back a few months later and said, I haven't been able to find anybody else, so I'm going to ask you again, will you come and help me with this work? So I said, okay, I'll come for 3 months, and that will give you long enough to get somebody else. And of course, that's 40 years ago now. Well,
his peers were not encouraging of John to take on this work because they saw it as something that was controversial. It was in 1953 when there was not much known about fertility. The only methods of contraception actually were condoms, so we didn't have pills and etc. But his peers said, no, it's going to ruin your career. Don't take it on.
Certain things come across your path, certain things in a way are dropped into your lap, and you have to examine them and look at them and see whether it would be a good thing for you to pick up the ball and run with it, so to speak, or turn away. And I think that perhaps at that time that God is inviting you to do something, I was hooked by the couples who were coming for help.
These were couples who were married couples who were struggling, and John knew there had to be a better way. There had to be a way in nature. Both John and Father Catarinich were men who believed God always had a purpose in everything. John started helping women with the temperature, with rhythm calculations, and the mucus. But by the late 60s, he was saying, I think that the women are able to identify their fertility if they just went with mucus alone. And that's when the ovulation method really came into its fore. So he started listening to women, very patiently listening to women. And as he said, he certainly discovered it by listening to women. And he always said that it was the women themselves that really discovered the method for him. He listened and recorded what they were saying. He asked them to record any time that they had a discharge in their cycle. And it was from that that he was able to identify that there was a connection between potential fertility and menstruation.
Dr. John Billings continues to gather information from his meetings with women, tracking menstrual cycles and following up on the data. By the end of the 1950s, there's clear evidence that the beginning and the end of the fertile phase of a woman's cycle are reliably defined by the patterns in cervical mucus. What could be more organic than that?
The trait that we see most in the millennial generation is the desire for authenticity. And right now, two things are on a collision course. One is the desire to live organically and naturally and authentically, and the other is the desire to live by the rules of the sexual revolution, which is inorganic, technological control of fertility.
Everybody's running out and buying, free-range eggs and chicken, and then they're popping a birth control pill, and that doesn't make any sense.
It's part of a general trend towards natural things, avoiding pollution of the environment and avoiding pollution of our bodies. And that's why so many people are attracted to it, apart from its effectiveness. This is the most modern of the natural methods of regulating fertility. It's altogether different from the rhythm method, the calendar method, and it's highly effective, easily understood. It's been subjected to rigorous scientific investigation, which has proven the validity of the method, and it's now being used by millions of people all around the world.
Only a very small percentage of women around the world know how to read the language of their own bodies. So the good thing is that we have in ourselves messages that we can learn how to read, whether we are in a good health condition or if something's happening. And we can use these messages for three main reasons. We can use them whether we want to achieve a pregnancy. Sometimes we don't want to achieve a pregnancy, but many times in our life, or let's say during our whole life, we want to be healthy. And so we can use these messages as well to improve our health and our well-being. And so we can track the messages our body sends us, and we can see whether, for example, we're ovulating or we're not ovulating. And ovulation in women is a sign of health during their reproductive years.
NFP is easier than people think. Basically, if a woman is keen enough to understand when she has a runny nose, then she's keen enough to understand when she might be fertile.
Once a woman learns about this, she will continue using it through the rest of her life.
Meanwhile, a doctor from Sweden is doing some complementary work because Grace was overflowing all the more. Around 1953, Dr. Eric Odeblad spends a year at the University of California in Berkeley and Stanford as a Rockefeller Foundation Fellow, and he learns about new techniques for the study of cervical mucus, mainly nuclear magnetic resonance. This is from a video that John and Evelyn Billings made discussing the work that was being done.
Professor Erik Udeblad is the Professor of Medical Biophysics at the University of Umeå in the north of Sweden. He is both a physicist and a gynecologist. When he completed his studies of gynecology, he took up an academic appointment, but he soon learned that he could not expect advancement in that appointment unless he was prepared to undertake surgical abortions, and he refused to do this. So he turned back to his knowledge of physics and decided to enter medical research and to undertake a study of the physical properties of cervical mucus using very sophisticated modern techniques. Professor Odeblad's work has explained many of the mysteries of the activity of the cervix and have shown the importance of the cervix with regard to the achievement of conception.
Maximum shift occurs 1 or 2 or even 3 days before ovulation. So I think all these things together strongly support what you are finding here.
Years later, in 1994, Dr. Odeblad meets Pope John Paul II, who thanked him for his work.
This revolutionary method, insofar as the mucus, which was totally new idea, was really developed by the early 60s. And John had written a book, and it was finished in the early 60s. But Jim Brown, Professor James Brown, came to Melbourne, who was a well-known endocrine chemist. And John approached him and asked him whether he would be prepared to investigate his clinical studies in the laboratory. Jim's response was, "I've always hoped that my work would be able to be used in a natural method."
And I worked with Professor Brown for more than 30 years when I was working in his laboratory at the Royal Women's Hospital here in Melbourne. Professor Brown was born in New Zealand. He went to Auckland University College. He graduated with honours and a master's. So he had his master's degree by the time he was 20 years of age, which tells you about a little bit about how intelligent he actually was. Yeah, so it was in the 50s that Professor Brown was able to then start mapping the hormone levels in women during their menstrual cycle. And people were just starting to run in different directions with this information. What very few people know is that Professor Brown actually did some work with Pincus, who was the lead scientist on the pill. And Professor Brown was quite horrified. He was really quite appalled at the way the pill shut the woman's reproductive system down so thoroughly.
I was involved with Pincus in the early days. One of the first applications we had of our hormone analysis was to test Pincus's pill.
Dr. Gregory Pincus was a tremendously talented scientist, but he also did not have much of a moral sense. And so in the 1930s at Harvard, he was trying to create rabbits through in vitro fertilization in petri dishes, and he was kicked out as a result of that.
And no other university would hire him ever again. Aldous Huxley's novel Brave New World had just been published, and it had this narrative about fatherless test tube babies born with no spirit, no humanity. And the timing was ominous. So Pincus is depicted in the New York Times and in Collier's magazine as this Dr. Frankenstein figure. So Pincus founds his own private laboratory, the Worcester Foundation for Experimental Biology. And at that time, it was unheard of for anyone to open their own private lab. Universities had ethics committees, so scientists couldn't just do whatever they wanted regardless of the ethics. But by starting his own lab, Pincus could do whatever he wanted, and that's what he did.
As a leading reproductive biologist, he came into Sanger's notice, and she asked him if he could help her with this project of developing a simple method. He thought that he could. We know Margaret Sanger as the founder of Planned Parenthood, and she was also the visionary behind the pill. What is generally less known about Sanger is that she was also a eugenicist, and that means that she divided the world up into two types of people, what she called the fit and the unfit. And the pill was connected to her eugenic ideas because a eugenicist wanted to find a method of birth control that the so-called unfit could use.
Unfit for what? Unfit for love? I really don't know love at all. Unfit to live?
I've looked at life from both sides now, from win and lose, and still somehow it's life's illusions I recall. I really don't know life at all.
Sanger at this point was 71 years old, but she still had not given up this search for an inexpensive, easy-to-use, foolproof, effective method of contraception. Margaret Sanger and Dr. Pincus met for the first time in the winter of 1950 at a dinner party in Manhattan. And it was at this dinner party that Sanger asked Dr. Pincus, "Do you think it would be possible?" "I think so," Pincus said. Well then, start right away, Sanger responded. Pincus drove back to his laboratory in Shrewsbury, which is outside of Boston, Massachusetts, after meeting with Sanger. He and his assistant, Dr. Chang, started to work on developing a birth control pill and on in vitro fertilization. Dr. Pincus was trying to invent a new artificial way of preventing babies, but also a new way of creating them. He began by testing if giving rabbits progesterone would hinder their ovulation. He was able to achieve some measure of success with rabbits, but then the challenge was, now we have to test it on humans. Distributing contraceptives at this point was still illegal in Massachusetts, so they had to turn to a family physician by the name of Dr. John Rock, who had a large infertility practice. They realized that they could work with him and test the pill on these women. What they told these women was that the pill would inhibit their fertility initially, but then they might have a rebound effect.
Dr. Rock and Dr. Pincus managed to enroll about 70 women in these tests, with no consent forms, by the way. And half of the women dropped out because of the severe side effects, which included nausea and vomiting.
At this point, Dr. Pincus's biggest private financial backer was Catherine Dexter McCormick, and in one letter to Margaret Sanger, she said that we need to find a cage of ovulating females to test the pill on, and in fact, that's what they managed to do. They found this cage in the Worcester State Hospital, which was also known as the Worcester Insane Asylum. Those patients were not informed properly of the side effects of the pill. The fact that they couldn't find people to test the pill on who were capable of informed consent indicates what a serious medicine this was that they were testing. Many of the patients were there for things like paranoia, but also you had people there who were there for dementia and Alzheimer's. The hospital was understaffed and overcrowded. Patients were disheveled and malnourished. The patients were put in straitjackets, they were tethered to beds, underwent lobotomies, electroshock and insulin treatments. Into this environment, Dr. Pincus brought his whole family for about 6 months. They lived in a wing of the hospital, and his children later would describe what that was like, hearing the howls of inmates, and it was it was every bit as bad as you might expect living in an insane asylum in the 1950s. And so this is the population that Dr. Pincus decided he should do experiments on.
Dr. Gregory Pincus realizes pretty early on that tests on a few women in the psychiatric hospitals and gynecology practices would never be enough. So in 1954, Pincus writes to Catherine McCormick, his financial backer, and says that the experiments, which were becoming more difficult in the US, could be much more easily done in Puerto Rico on a large scale.
In the mid-1950s, Dr. Gregory Pincus began his work in Puerto Rico by working with medical students who were pressured into joining the trials. Because so many students dropped out of the trial, Dr. Pincus needed to find another population. He approached the government to ask if he could experiment on the women in prison. However, contrary to what happened in Worcester, in Puerto Rico, the inmates refused. So they had very limited results. They didn't know anything about long-term effects. They didn't know how the pill might affect the children who might have been conceived. They had evidence of deaths and serious side effects. They had to do something in order to get more data to present to the FDA in order to get approval for the pill. The pharmaceutical companies knew that a birth control pill was a potential gold mine. So the pill would be the first drug that healthy women would take. And they would take it daily, and they would take it possibly for years.
It was so clever to try and get every woman on earth to take a drug every day of her fertile life. That is a dream for a pharmacology business. And now we know, decades later, exactly as Paul VI predicted, if you don't respect the natural rhythms of the body, you're going to be messing yourself up one way or another, your relationships, your own health. Well, now we know, a generation or two later, that these drugs do have all sorts of undesired effects on women and possibly on the wider environment too.
The way our healthcare system is set up now, physicians really aren't given the time to spend with patients. They have 10, 15 minutes maybe for a visit. So it's much easier for them to simply write a prescription for the birth control pill. I would say my colleagues are not necessarily, would not necessarily say they are motivated by the pharmaceutical industry or pushed by the pharmaceutical industry or motivated by profit. But I can tell you without a doubt that the pharmaceutical industry plays a huge role in medical education and in pushing and promoting birth control.
We were the first people to do any thorough investigation of how the pill worked. And I was aghast when, without any more further testing, they shoved it on the market.
Professor Brown was appalled that women so readily embraced the pill and took it without the longitudinal studies that should have been done before it was put out to the public. Professor Brown was a fantastic record keeper. So he documented everything that he had done, and towards the end of his life, he calculated that he had done more than 850,000 hormone assays over his lifetime. He was offered a position to continue working with Pincus, but he turned that down and instead took a position in Melbourne to continue doing the work that he loved to do. And it was at that time that he met Lynn and John Billings.
With Dr. James Brown gone, Dr. Pincus was left to his personal quest to develop an artificial form of contraception, and he would not be deterred. The pill becomes an instant hit, but not without serious side effects. By 1962, 1.2 million American women are on the pill, and after 3 years, the number almost doubles to 2.3 million in 1965. Dr. John Rock gains national attention for his cause with the publication of his book, The Time Has Come, a Catholic doctor's proposal to end the battle over birth control. His justification of the wide use of artificial contraception takes root among Catholics, including Catholic leaders. In 1969, Barbara Shaman publishes The Doctor's Case Against the Pill, a book exposing the side effects and risks including blood clots, heart attacks, stroke, depression, weight gain, and a decrease in libido. The book is damaging, but it gets very little shelf space, so the pill rolls on. The pill remains the most common contraceptive, with over 10 million users in the U.S. In 2013, it was estimated that Americans spent $3.8 billion on pharmaceutical products in the family planning classification.
1 out of 4 marriages were ending in divorce. By 1975, 50% of marriages were ending in divorce. That's an unbelievable increase in divorce in a very short period, in 15 years. In the history of mankind, the divorce rate has never doubled in a 15-year period.
Abortion is legalized in America in 1973. For many reasons, it's difficult to know the real number of abortions that have taken place since Roe v. Wade, but suffice it to say, we're getting very close to 60 million at the time this documentary is being made, and that's just in the United States.
As of the invention of the birth control pill and the sexual revolution, humanity acquires a deep interest in not forming families the way families used to be formed. And it is the lack of family formation, I argue, that is driving people out of church. Now, how does this happen? In lots of different ways. First of all, consider what brings people into church. Very often, it's getting married and having a baby. The experience of having a baby is thought of by most people who have had the privilege as a transcendental experience, a supernatural experience. This, in its own way, points people toward the idea of a creator. Most people do not experience their children as blobs of cells. They experience them as created beings, the likes of which could only have been done by a god. At least this is true for many people.
There's one more person to join the effort to bring NFP to the far reaches of the world, and this is none other than Dr. Evelyn Billings, the wife of Dr. John Billings.
She said, the trouble is you men don't know how to communicate with women, and it's women who are the ones you have to talk to. She said, I'll come and help you. And so she was stuck. And then for the rest of her life, she and her husband had to go around together.
John and Lynn Billings had a book ready to be published, but it was decided that they should wait just a little bit longer until they had the hormonal validation.
Dr. Lynn Billings wasn't really interested in family planning either at this point, and she was happy for John to be working with Father Katarinic. But it was when that she read the manuscript of the book that she realised what they were really working on. And she used to say that it was then that she became interested and said to them, I better do something to help. And we have to remember that this is around the time that the pill was coming onto the market as well. But John decided, after the advice of Father Katarinic, that they would wait. They would wait until they got the results of the studies so that they could be incorporated into the book. By 1964, the results were there, so the book was published. The first book, The Ovulation Method, was then published.
I do remember having some really fun exchanges with John and Evelyn, very warm, lovely, lovely people, and my goodness, what a gift they have given to the church and the world, and it really has yet to be tapped.
What I appreciate most about the Billings was their willingness to respond to the call for people of science to search and study and research the information about the human body and about the gift of our fertility.
The most important thing is that how they lived their lives in continuous humbleness, but also very joyful. You see, they were very happy.
They just seem to be a perfect fit, you know, in all aspects of their lives, their professional life. And,
well, people talk about couples being made for one another. They certainly were. They even looked alike.
I don't think so.
Oh, well, I do.
And we knew that they may have been feeling sometimes very tired. Other times they may, as they were getting old, you see that they had some difficulties in getting to different places. But the continuous joy that they shared with everybody, I think that's by far what impressed me the most.
Late in his pontificate, Pope John XXIII establishes the Commission for the Study of the Problems of the Family, Population, and Birth Rate, a group of 6 people to study questions of birth control and population. Pope Paul VI would add more theologians to the commission, and over 3 years expands it to 72 members representing 5 continents. In 1967, the report from the Papal Commission was leaked and published in the National Catholic Reporter. According to the majority of the commission, artificial birth control is said to not be intrinsically evil. They said Catholic couples should be allowed to decide the issue for themselves. Approval from the church would generate billions, but everybody knew that the Pope needed to acquiesce to the opinion of this commission. The natural method that John and Evelyn Billings were perfecting was being overshadowed, and it would soon become very difficult to get this information out to women. As expected, Paul VI would not go along. Instead, he issues his masterpiece encyclical in 1968 called Humane Vitae, and he reaffirmed church teaching on sexuality.
Then I saw your face. Now I'm a believer without a trace of doubt in my mind. I'm in love. Yeah, I couldn't leave you if I tried.
Humane Vitae immediately creates a major controversy. Not only does it reaffirm traditional Christian teaching on sexuality, but it also opposes all contraceptives and predicts that society, and in particular marriages, will suffer if the use of contraception, the pill being the most obvious one, becomes widespread.
When I look back on Humane Vitae now, all these years later, I'm impressed at the deep sense that the Pope has of the relationship of these issues of sexual morality to a sound anthropology, a sound understanding of what it is a human being is in the first place.
Pope Paul VI's first prediction was that there would be an uptick in marital infidelity and also this general lowering of moral standards.
Few people would deny that the rates of abortion, divorce, family breakdown, venereal disease, and out-of-wedlock births have massively increased since the Pope wrote that encyclical in the 1960s.
We've seen in the research is that really kids who were born in the 1950s, who were born in the early 1960s, the vast majority of those kids would have grown up with their own biological parents. But in the late 1960s, all that began to change. We saw an increase in divorce, increase in non-marital childbearing, and so as a consequence of that, we've seen a massive uptick in the number of kids who are being exposed to divorce and family instability and single parenthood.
I think we see the divorce rate, continuing to explode because of contraception, because of abortion, because of the secrecy, because of the barriers that these things have put in between a man and a woman.
We live in a world now where most American kids will not be raised by their own married parents. And that is often devastating for those kids and for communities that have lots of kids who are being raised, outside of intact married families. So that's what's happened in really the last half century in America. And again, this whole process began to unfold in the 1960s.
Paul VI saw that it was precisely the orientation of sex toward children, toward the future, that kept sex from being selfish. And that once sex became structurally about me and my projects and not about us and the future, which is what children are, they're about us and the future. Once sex becomes about me and my projects, that people are going to be used and people are going to get hurt.
Once sex was available on a kind of consequence-free basis, people were much more likely to have sex outside of marriage. So the norm against premarital sex basically disappeared to an important extent in the 60s and 70s with the arrival of contraception. And then that ironically led to more people having sex outside of marriage and having then babies outside of marriage. And so the ironic consequence was that we saw a pretty dramatic increase in single parenthood in the 60s and 70s in the wake of the contraceptive and sexual revolutions that kind of worked together.
Christianity is a religion that revolves around a holy family. And the idea of a benevolent God in heaven and a benevolent adoptive father on earth for Jesus, that would be Joseph. How can you explain that story in a time when so many children have no idea what a benevolent father looks like?
Paul VI's encyclical further predicts that men will reduce women to mere instruments for the satisfaction of his own desires.
He foresaw the disrespect men would show womankind, warning us, and this is from Humane Vitae, he said, a man who grows accustomed to the use of contraceptive methods may forget the reverence due to a woman, and disregarding her physical and emotional equilibrium, he may no longer consider her as his partner, whom he should surround with care and affection.
Paul VI was extremely prescient and correct to worry right at the beginnings of the modern sexual revolution that the consequence would be, among other things, the commodification of the person, the reduction of the person to the status of a thing, and it's exactly what's happened.
And so once the pill comes along, sex is cheap because women expect little in return for it, and men have to provide very little in terms of resources and wooing in order to access it.
But as of the sexual revolution, a great many young women are victims or have been victims of men having no intention to create a family with them.
And that's where sort of this like radical notion of feminism pops up. And they're saying we don't want to be complementary to men, we want to be as men. We want to be able to have careers without the burden of fertility always hanging in the back of our minds. And so we want to be able to have sex without consequences. Women have been told from the time that they're little girls, you know, you can do whatever you want. You can be whoever you want, and you don't need a man. You can do this on your own. And so that's created a culture where women are angry at men, and they don't rely on men to help them and to be that complementary partner to them. And so then men have turned against women as women have turned against men. And so, you know, we sort of just see this cycle.
Fertility properly orients our sexual attitudes and behaviors towards the truth of marriage and family life, right? And this is one of the great problems, not only of contraceptive practice, but of contraceptive mentality. It disorients our sexual attitudes and behaviors away from marriage and family life, merely towards the pursuit of my own selfish pleasure. This is the world we live in today. A person is considered valuable if you bring me sexual pleasure. This is not love. This is lust, plain and simple.
Lust doesn't work. Lust is the idea that you can make yourself happy by using other human beings as means to your own selfish pleasure. It doesn't work. Never has worked, never will. Charity, God's version of love, is equally testable by experience. It makes you happy. It doesn't seem to. Forgetting yourself, giving yourself away, sacrificing yourself for others, loving your neighbor as yourself, not just as a means to yourself, that sounds like the sure recipe for unhappiness. But all who have tried it are happy. The saints are happy. The sinners are unhappy. You can't argue with that. I think Mother Teresa probably won more converts with her smile than with her words.
This is the consumerist mentality, very utilitarian mentality applied to human relationships. And it's terribly destructive to our hearts. And we know it. We don't need a pope to tell us it. We know this. We are meant to be loved in the unrepeatable mystery of our humanity.
Pope Paul VI's third prediction in Humane Vitae, he spelled out how governments would use contraception abusively against entire populations.
I saw that firsthand in China. I saw the government of China using abortion, sterilization, surgical contraception, chemical contraception to stop people from having children. So what Pope Paul VI predicted would happen, did happen. But what people don't know is that Pope Paul VI's prediction came true in many other countries as well. North Korea sterilizes and aborts women against their will. Vietnam had a two-child policy for many, many years. We see Pope Paul VI's prophecy come true in Africa and in Latin American countries, in Mexico, for example, where the United States pushed very hard beginning in the 1960s for the Mexican government to sterilize all Mexican women who came in to give birth. Every Mexican woman who comes into a government hospital in Mexico to give birth is encouraged in quotes, to leave either with an IUD or with being tubally ligated and having her tubes tied. Many Indian states have two-child policies, and they punish people who have more than two children by preventing them from running for political office, for example, or denying villages where the right number of women and men haven't been chemically or surgically sterilized, denying them fertilizer or access to irrigation water.
John and Evelyn Billings traveled to India in the 70s and also saw much of this with their own eyes. John writes about it in his unpublished personal diary. In some places in India, there is now very serious effort being made to impose compulsory abortion upon any woman who has two children. The government has encouraged, and local authorities have taken up brutal measures, brutal in every sense of the word, to control the size of the population. We learned of one young man from a relatively prosperous family who had committed a traffic offense when driving a car. He was taken to the police station and told that he could choose between a term of imprisonment with consequent dishonor to his family and sterilization. He chose to be sterilized, and he died as a result of the operation.
And during that terrible time that we had in India, when sterilization was enforced, I went to the government and I proved that with the help of our sisters, we have helped the government on natural basis to have 30,000 less babies in the 3 years. And I could prove that with all whatever I had in my hand. And the result was an identity card for every single family. And you will be very surprised to know that every person that showed that card was not touched. Though many were forced into it, but these families who had been practicing the family planning and had this identity card were not touched. They were respected. We are also fighting abortion by adoption. We have sent word to all the clinics, to all the hospitals, to all the police stations. Don't destroy the child. Give us the child and we will take care of the child. But just at that time, government of India passed an order, the sealing of the land. That is, a family that had lots of land and had no children, they would take away the land. And the result was that our children went like hotcakes. It was a real, beautiful answer in a very simple way to our prayer.
Indeed, government saw an opportunity. And in the very beginning, they were even uncautious about it. And they would say, here's our contraceptive programs so we can have fewer poor people. I mean, they were out and out open about it. Under the Nixon administration in the U.S., the National Security Memorandum 2000 said, we need to lower the number of children, humans, in the third world. And so we're going to make contraception part of our international relations. So now it has morphed into the language of contraception as women's rights, contraception as enabling you to have sexual freedom, sexual pleasure. But make no mistake about it, it has always played a role in domestic and international desires to reduce the numbers of certain people.
In 1939, the Negro Project, Margaret Sanger was a very smart woman. She was very savvy. What she did was she realized that black communities put everything into their churches. The black church at the time was considered our town hall. It was the place we went to strategize. It was the place we went to worship God. We gathered there for picnics and family gatherings and family outings. I mean, that was our town hall. That was our meeting place. And she knew that. So what did she do? She went to the members of the clergy and she paid members of the clergy to take the message to their communities, to their congregations, that abortion, that sterilization and abortion was the way to go. If you want a better life, the best thing you can do is limit the growth of your population. She also went to community organizers, the people who worked in their communities, and of course, many blacks bought into it. They thought, well, you know what, they must know. I mean, it's a clergy member, it's a community member, an upstanding member of our community. They must know the best way for us to have a better life. They bought into it. Margaret Sanger started it back in 1939. It was her business model, her plan, and it was actually genius on her part. But the whole idea was to limit the growth of the black population, which she called human weeds. She said it was necessary to limit the population of these people who were basically unfit, as far as she was concerned. Today, Planned Parenthood has 72 to 75% of its facilities located in minority neighborhoods. The headquarters of Planned Parenthood are based in New York City, and incidentally, in New York City, more black babies are aborted than born alive.
Sometimes contraception does fail. We know that. They knew that then. We know that now. So then what, right? Now there's a consequence. So, and we don't want that. So how do we eliminate that consequence? And so that's really when we saw Dr. Bernard Nathanson and his group of people in the 60s. That's when NARAL was formed, and it was formed by two men who were listening to women say, we want to not have a burden of a child. We do not want to be slaves to our fertility. We do not want to be slaves to our uterus. And so these two doctors came forward and they said, well, we're gonna start this organization and we're gonna spread abortion across the country. And abortion is going to become a part of family planning. Abortion is going to become the new birth control method, the new backup plan, the new plan B. And then they found out how lucrative the abortion was. They found out how lucrative of an industry it could actually be. And so then that started spreading even more. And that's when Planned Parenthood really got in the mix, because they saw that they could get a piece of this as well. You know, back before 1973, there were a few clinics doing abortions in New York and some other places, but Planned Parenthood was not. Planned Parenthood was not, they were just contraceptive minded back in that time. It wasn't until, in fact, there are brochures that you can find from Planned Parenthood that were out in the 50s and 60s that said that a unique individual human life begins at conception. There are pamphlets that from Planned Parenthood that talk about how abortion actually kills a human being. You can go and find these. But then that changed when they realized how lucrative of a business model this could be. And all of that stemmed back to Margaret Sanger and her work, the women's rights movement, which sort of partnered with the suffragist movement as well, and women not wanting to have babies, women wanting to be like men, women wanting to have careers like men, women wanting to live a consequence-free lifestyle like men could supposedly do.
In this attitude, one can see the organic link between contraception and abortion.
The fourth and last prediction Pope Paul VI gave in Humane Vitae was, he warned that people would develop a notion of total dominion over their own bodies and even the bodies of others. He said, we must accept that there are certain limits beyond which it's wrong to go to the power of man over his own body and its natural functions. And in the world we live in today, we have transgenderism and euthanasia and reproductive technologies. And you can see how right he was.
Interestingly, on various anniversaries of Humane Vitae, sometimes journals as prestigious as the New York Times, The Atlantic, will write about how its prophecies have come to pass. People, I think the Financial Times, not a religious source, did a remarkable piece on that. And you can even look at the work of economists on the sex and marriage marketplaces.
When you think about contraception, it's sex without babies. So once you've made that move to say, well, we can just kind of focus on the sex without the babies and put the reproduction to the side, then you say, well, what about the flip side of the coin? Reproductive technologies would be babies without sex. I mean, you've already said with the contraception that you can separate these two meanings. So now why not turn to the lab? Why not pay somebody down the street in the fertility clinic to make the baby for you? This is just a logical extension of this same kind of manipulability of our own personhood. There are some individuals who, as they have grown up and come to an awareness that, oh, I came into the world this way, and they reflect on it, they do sense a kind of incompleteness or something within themselves that's not right. And they're starting to write about this, about how, you know, I was the product of a cold financial transaction, rather than being engendered in the warmth of the marital embrace between my parents. And there's an awareness, you know, that I was brought into the world then, maybe to satisfy certain desires that my mom or my dad had at that moment. And there's a sense in which I was then being used.
I am saying that in reality, the processes and the medicalization of it and the marketing that encourages it gives rise to the idea not that children have a right to parents, but that parents have a right to babies, which is a reverse of everything American family law ever stood for, but that has been flipped on its head.
The way I was conceived, it corrupted my entire understanding of marriage and family and human sexuality, because I was taught that you use people to get what you want, that people are disposable, you can just throw them away and never see them again. You don't even need to know their names, right?
This is why being donor conceived hurts so much. I understand the deep desire for children, and I understand our need to rationalize, you know, the means for the sake of the ends. But the beginning can never be separated from the end. So living my life without knowing who my father is has been very painful. And I know that children need their mother and their father, and they need to understand our anthropology, their anthropology, where we come from, where we're headed.
Well, I used to wonder, why does God in His providence permit these good people to have such tremendous problems, and other people like myself He doesn't give these terrible problems to? Well, I think really, if we want to get into theology, I think that he gives those problems to people who are able to deal with them.
We could perhaps ask for the strength to accept our suffering as a gift from God and not be so willing to pass it off onto someone else, even when it comes to having or not having children. Naked I come forth from my mother's womb, and naked shall I go back there. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.
You pick your teacher, pick her wise, or else prepare to pick our life. Make the most of what you've got and give the access to a wide-eyed bride by a good man's side. Set him off on a serious ride. Put a good book to it, find a car, stick to it. Could your muse be a fool in disguise?
It's just my body, and I should be able to do whatsoever I deem suitable and fitting. Well, the reality here is different. Our bodies are not some kind of arbitrary reality that we just manipulate to satisfy a different self. Our bodies are given to us in a kind of stewardship.
What the Pope's teaching us is that we are not mere machines for having satisfactions. We are persons. This stuff, this physical stuff, is not just machinery. It's not just plumbing. This stuff is part of the very substance of the human person.
From the fourth prediction of Pope Paul VI, much has flowed: in vitro fertilization, artificial reproduction, embryo experimentation, cloning, perhaps also assisted suicide, physician-assisted suicide, and other efforts at self-destruction. When we don't respect life at the beginning, it's easy for us to lose respect for life at the end. All of these things are descendants of contraceptive technology and the contraceptive mentality.
We wanted the body to be our ultimate fulfillment. We wanted sex to be ultimate pleasure and ultimate happiness. That's what the sexual revolution held out to us.
In 2,000 years of the Church's history, there's not a single official document which has been hated, despised, rejected, and disobeyed by more Catholics than Humane Vitae. That's how important it is. So I think Humane Vitae is almost, to our time, what the Nicene Creed was to the 4th century.
I suspect that at the heart of the Catholic ambivalence towards Humane Vitae, and there's lots of ambivalence, we have not a crisis of sexuality nor a crisis of church authority, or even maybe a crisis of moral relevance. But rather, it's a question of faith. Do we really believe that God is good and that we can trust him?
I'm not sure how Paul VI could have been more right about what has happened 50 years later. And it's amazing that he's looking into the future, doing in some ways guesswork, right? Because it wasn't yet that way then. We had the 60s were kind of a turbulent time, but he's looking in. The uptake had not been wide yet. There's calls for it, etc. But he's looking into the future and saying, this is not going to work out well for women. And by golly, he was right on the money on that.
The Catholic Church has never wavered from their stand on the sanctity of human life and the value of human life. And they're right. And they've always been right. They're not in this to be trendy or to go with the masses or just to do what their congregation, what their parishioners want them to do. But they've always held fast to these truths.
In 1968, when Humane Vitae was released, Professor Brown, a Presbyterian, went straight to Lynn and John and congratulated them on the church stance. In the 1990s, he received a papal award, even though he's a Presbyterian and not a Catholic. But he continued to do this work for the good of the family.
By this time, Doctors John and Evelyn Billings were being invited to teach the Billings ovulation method around the world, first in New Zealand, followed by Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia, and then across the globe, including India, Africa, all the Central American countries, and finally in the US.
India was a place where the method was starting to spread. That Mother Teresa's sisters were learning the method and spreading it so that the message was getting out. I think the Billingses went to India something like 17 times on the invitation of Mother Teresa.
At first, they set up centres where they taught in a very, very simple way the poor people how to put that into practice. And I believe it was very, very successful there, and it spread to other parts of the world.
The teaching of these young sisters has brought new light, new love, new joy into so many families. In the beginning, when we started doing the family planning, I think we were the first nuns that tried to do something like that, and many people were laughing at us. And I started calling it Holy Family Planning.
Paul VI called on medical scientists in Humane Vitae and in speeches thereafter to really turn their science to helping us understand the human body and fertility, because the fact is most people then knew very little about the way a woman's body works. My guess is many people today know very little about it. It's a great mystery, probably to nearly all men, but even remarkably to many women, of how a woman's fertility works.
In 1969, their work was recognised by Pope Paul VI when John was awarded a papal knighthood. Sometime later, the Pope personally thanked John and Lynn in a private audience for the work that they were doing, but he thanked them in the name of Jesus Christ, and he encouraged them to continue with their great work.
The Billingses took up that call in spades. They really devoted themselves to that in a way that sadly many others who could have and should have did not. And so I think Paul VI loved them for that, for the subsequent decade that he, after Humane Vitae, that he was able to encourage them, and then his successors in John Paul and Benedict.
I thought that when I first started speaking out against donor conception, that people would hear my story and hear me say, you know, hey guys, children need their fathers. You can't do this anymore. And they would be so grateful for my witness and mend their misguided ways. But instead, I learned that our drive to have children is very strong. And realizing that me complaining about my father loss publicly wasn't going to change the world as thoroughly as I'd like, I started to instead think about, you know, why are the infertility rates so high? And can we remedy the core issue here, which is, why are people's bodies so broken? Why are people's relationships so broken? And finally, I decided that artificial contraception is at the heart of our infertility crisis. And that's because artificial contraception is both clinically toxic to the body and it exacerbates bad behaviors.
The birth control pill actually ages the cervix, so that a woman who is on the birth control pill from the age of 20 to 30, if she goes off the pill at 30, she doesn't have the cervix of a 30-year-old. She has the cervix of a 40-year-old, because she's not able to produce the type of cervical fluid that is critical to allow fertilization to occur. So again, I just feel like as a society, we're not fully informing women, which is ironic because we talk about choice and informed choice. But as a society, we don't truly inform women about their fertility and about the way their body is designed so that they can make truly informed choices.
You know, quantitatively, you have less marriage overall. You have later marriage because people can have sexual relationships, you know, beginning in their teens and 20s because of contraception, they feel, and not suffer, they feel, the risk of sexually transmitted diseases or pregnancy. We have more non-marital pregnancies, up to 40% in the United States. We have more abortion than we have more divorce. Marrying later, settling for less than what you really might have wanted if you're not worried about marrying at all, and how therefore the pill has contributed to people's, women in particular, who file most divorces, just feeling after a few years of marriage that, it's not what I thought. But if they hadn't been able to disconnect sex, marriage, and children all along, this may not have happened.
After 50 years of this contraceptive revolution, are people any happier? Are we better at maintaining good, healthy, long-lasting marriages and relationships? Well, demonstrably not. Demonstrably, we are now the worst society in history at marrying and maintaining our marriages, at maintaining stable, long-term, happy families. Demonstrably, the promises of the 1960s and beyond have not been fulfilled.
By the 1970s, things are starting to move quickly for NFP. The World Health Organization approves the Billings method as a natural form of birth control, and by 1977, Dr. Eric Odeblad officially reports that his research into the activity of the cervix confirmed all the conclusions made by Dr. Billings. In 1980, Evelyn Billings releases her book.
Well, it was called the ovulation method, and for many years I remember John saying, they're wanting us to put our name to it, but he would refuse to do that because this is about nature. But the World Health Organization eventually said to them, you really have got to claim this as your own.
Is it possible to build a new civilization of life and love, as John Paul II invited? Is it possible to have a Billings revolution, a counter-revolution to the contraceptive sexual revolution of the 60s and beyond? Well, there are some big forces and factors at the moment in our culture that would point exactly in that direction, to saying we need to take a new direction if we're going to be happy.
In seeking to become whole again as persons, we need to begin by revisiting Humane Vitae with open hearts and open minds. Jesus said that the truth would make us free. Humane Vitae is filled with truth. It is therefore a key to freedom and to happiness.
For us to participate in the culture of death, for us to sever the body and the soul, to buy into the sexual revolution, that's the most dangerous thing. the solution to it has to start with us, not anywhere else.
Paul VI should be considered a prophet for seeing way out ahead of the sexual revolution, not only seeing what the consequences of it would be, but seeing what it implicitly means about what sexuality will be for us.
I think that the future has to be in love, or we won't have a future.
That sexual revolution, which was defined by the hippie generation and Woodstock and the so-called free love movement, has broken every one of its promises. Women did not experience more freedom, love was not free, contraception did not lead to better marriages or fewer abortions, and people did not reach some new level of lasting happiness. But a new sexual revolution is here, and it is defined by John Paul II's theology of the body, and before that by Paul VI and Humane Vitae, and before that by the work of John and Evelyn Billings and Dr. James Brown and Dr. Odeblad, and even before that by Christ, who himself reveals true marriage on the cross. True marriage is the fruitful giving of the total self over to another in love forever. Those promises are being kept. Our journey starts with Christ, who makes all things new, and in God, our Heavenly Father, who loves every person into being. That's where we find true fatherhood. If the new sexual revolution leads to marriages that last, to children being loved from the moment of natural conception, to men and women not seeing each other as disposable objects, it will be because we begin with, in, and through the truth. And the end of the journey always points back to the beginning. So may we begin with Christ, so that we may end with Christ.
Where there is no love, put in love, and you will draw out love.
Some things take their own sweet time. Yeah, some things take their own sweet time. You're worth waiting for, baby. You are so worth waiting for. You're the reason I believe in love. You're the one, you're the one. But some things take their own sweet time. Yeah, some things take their own sweet time. You're worth waiting for, baby. And you are so worth waiting for. You're the reason I believe in love. You're the one, you're the one.
Dear Jesus, help us to spread your fragrance everywhere we go. Flood our souls with your spirit and life. Penetrate and possess our whole being so utterly that our lives may only be a radiance of yours. Shine through us and so be so in us that every soul we come in contact with may feel your presence in our soul. Let them look up and see no longer us, but only Jesus. Stay with us, and then we shall begin to shine as you shine. So to shine as to be a light to others. The light of Jesus will be all from you. None of it will be ours. It will be you shining on others through us. Let us thus praise you in the way you love best, by shining on those around us. Let us preach you without preaching, not by words, but by our example, by the catching force, the sympathetic influence of what we do, the evident fullness of the love our hearts bear to you. Amen.